Well, let's start with what we saw happen over the weekend and how it resonate in the United States, if it will resonate, and that would be the election in Hungary where Viktor Orbán was tossed out. How are you interpreting those election results?
Yeah, certainly it will have resonance in the United States. So if you're not following Central European politics, you might wonder why it is that a prime minister of a Central European country, which has 10 million population or so, would be so important. And the answer is that Viktor Orban, over the past couple of decades, has been a central node in a financial, symbolic, and political network which connects far-right ideas to people with money. And that is why we saw J.D. Vance traveling to Budapest. That is why we saw both Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump support this man. And that, of course, is why it's interesting that he's been defeated, not only defeated, but crushed. I mean, crushed in an election which was uphill for his opponents. They still managed, despite a whole lot of familiar things to us, like gerrymandering, like intimidation, to win a constitutional majority. It's interesting that that thing can fall, but it's also disheartening for if you happen to be on the left or in the center, if you're a liberal, you may not know how important Orban is for the American far right or elements of it. And seeing him fall is like watching a teacher go. Orban essentially educated Vance, educated Trump. He was there before they were. And I think it's painful and demoralizing for them. And there's even something more fundamental, which is that I think some of these guys got themselves convinced the way Orban does politics is the only way to do politics. Orban forever, and you'll be fine forever. And this election says, no, history goes on. Get fed up with grift. They get fed up with condescending nationalism. And at a certain point, it can all crack up.
Was there something pivotal in this election when you saw the cracking up by the electorate who showed up, had enough of this? What do you think was the ultimate crack?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, and forgive me if I mention a few things, but one is independent media. So there can be scandals and the scandals can be suppressed by regime media or by big monopoly media. But so long as you have a few independent media, the scandals can come out. That happened in Hungary. Second, you can have a movement that connects scandal to larger forces. So there were individual scandals in Hungary. Interestingly, one of them, like had to do with sexual abuse of minors. Those scandals can be connected to the larger issue of abuse of power and corruption. And the third thing is that there was a long, I mean, you're asking for one thing, I'm sorry, but years, local organizing for 2 years before this election. And then the final thing, which you mentioned, and it's the result of all of this, is the high turnout, right? You don't get high turnout just because you exhort each other to vote. You get high turnout because you prepare and because people have an understanding of how their vote's going to matter. All that happened in Hungary. But then the turnout was so high and the margins were so great that whatever thoughts Orban might have had about not recognizing the outcome, he couldn't realize them. And so the point that like there's a moment for me, the moment was about when I saw that with the vast majority already counted, the win was going to be overwhelming. Then I realized, okay, this is going to change. He's going to have to go.
Well, with so much conversation about future elections in this country, did you suspect that there would be some argument about elections and the validity of ballots in Hungary?
It was already set up. That scenario was already set up, and it was partly set up by us, by which I mean the American government. There was a whole story that Orban, again, Viktor Orban being the Hungarian prime minister who's been in power for the last 16 years and has now lost power after losing an election overwhelmingly. The Orban told a story about how there are Ukrainian and they're all powerful and they've penetrated Hungary and they may be trying to fix the election. And then our vice president, J.D. Vance, went to Budapest to interfere in the Hungarian elections, basically on Orban's side, and repeated that story. So they had done the preparatory work for somebody interfered with our elections, therefore they're invalid. So that, of course, is morally very upsetting, especially that we took part in it. But it's clear that politically it wasn't going to work. The turnout was too high. The margins were too big. And I should also say they also tried something, and this is again just like it's a little alert for things that happen in the summer or the fall. Orban tried a false flag terrorist thing. So one way you can try to rig an election is to say we've got an emergency. It was the opposition. Now we can't have the election, or now we have to ban the opposition. They tried that about a year ago. Orban said, "Oh, we've discovered this terrorist plot to blow up a pipeline, and oh, it turns out it was the Ukrainians, and da da da." And the thing is, the opposition had already predicted this and inoculated the population to it, and so it just didn't really have any resonance. It didn't matter one way or the other. So there was a stunt, and one of the worst kinds of stunts, but it fell flat.
How are you interpreting his successor, Peter Major, and what he represents? Because he does seem to, it's a little bit, at least in my early reading of him, it seems a bit difficult to completely understand where he stands on all issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think the crucial thing, if you're in an opposition type situation, is to see him as somebody who did the work. I can't really overemphasize this point. Like if you're in the left or the American center and you're trying to figure out how to get stuff together, you have to build coalitions. And Magyar went out there and built a huge coalition, kind of book from center right almost all the way to the far left. And what the political science tells you is that if you want to win these kind of uphill elections where there's a competitive authoritarian system, you've got to do it. He's somebody, I mean, his politics are certainly evolving. He came from the Orban camp himself. He broke out publicly at the moment of the corruption scandal that we were talking about earlier, where it was revealed that the president of Hungary had pardoned someone who had been a sexual abuser of minors. And that pardon and that moment was when Magyar then gave an interview about the scale of corruption inside the Orban regime. I would say that he campaigned essentially as a kind of conservative or centrist who was quite liberal on social issues, right, including things like LGBT rights. So an inclusive conservative, but stress that the main issue is that he was campaigning for a Hungary where elections would count and where the law would matter, right? So in Hungary, the pocketbook issues of people being poorer than their European neighbors were clearly connected to the corruption issues of Orban misusing tax money and misusing transfers from the European Union. And that issue, right, that you don't like grift, that can be a center right issue because you like law and order, but it can also be a left wing issue because you don't like oligarchs. And I think he was able to bring those things together.
Well, I'll follow up on that part, especially the quality of life economics behind this in a moment as we bring this back to the United States. But before we get there, the United States, as you mentioned, going to Hungary, Vice President being there, it seemed to me that started to turn last week, at least in what I was reading, so that this was not a complete surprise. So it was a surprise to me that Vice President Vance was going there to campaign, knowing that this could not go the administration's way.
Oh, so much going on there. I mean, I'm not confident I understand what's going on inside the vice president's mind. I am tempted to think that he believes some of the things that he says. And if he does believe some of the things he says, he's inside a narrative according to which if you can just get rid of all of this wokery and just purge the campuses and stop talking in these nonsensical ways. Again, I'm trying to parrot the vice president. You'll find out that there's a real people on the other side and all that. And the real people, they just want far right politics. That seems to be, I mean, that's what he says. And let's imagine he believes that, which he may. Then I think that Orban was going to win, right? And this will have been something of a shock for him. I If I had to bet, I bet it would be a bit of a shock. But you're right. I mean, he remember also he and Orban they know each other personally. This is a clan relationship, right? In America, we think American politics are American and then there's foreign affairs. But that's not how MAGA works. MAGA is it's part of an international right-wing coalition which shares money and ideas and people with people like Orban and people like Putin. So from Vance's point of view, Orban is like a brother, or he's like a teacher. He's much closer to Orban than he is to any other American, right? And this is true of Trump as well. And so even if it's like your brother or your teacher, maybe the numbers tell you one thing, but your heart is saying, oh, my guy is going to win. So there may have been that element of it as well. That said, the independent poll that Orban was down by 20 plus points when things came around, and Vance went anyway. It doesn't look like it helped. If anything, it looks like it might have hurt a tiny little bit. And we got to remember that from the outside world, I think Vance, Trump, that whole group, I mean, they basically look like grifters. And grift is not popular internationally. And the whole Hungarian campaign was basically anti-grift. And the fact that Orban could pull in his coterie of international grifters, I don't think was going to make a positive impression on anybody except his own really diehard voters. But I'm sorry, Joe, I can't finish this question without saying that as an American, I find it personally shameful that we would go to another country and we would tell people how to vote. That's deeply disgusting, and we simply ought not to be doing things like that.
I'm speaking with Timothy Snyder, of course, best-selling author. He will be honored at Literary Lights presented by the Associates of the Boston Public Library on April 26th. Well, let's bring this back home now. And of course, you have studied moments like this throughout history in Europe and now here in the United States. There are so many echoes of what you just said about Hungary that we are feeling in the United States. There's a growing sense of corruption that could be tied to the Epstein files. There's a growing concern about just the cost of living in the United States and the economics. Of course, that's exacerbated by the war in Iran and there being no ceasefire or there being no agreement with Iran at this point after the weekend. So all of that and the fall of Viktor Orbán, what does that mean for a party, an administration trying to hold on to itself when these elements are falling away?
Yeah, I think there's some deep things that are shifting. One of them is the dominance of social media over personal politics, and that social media and kind of unreality campaigns have helped people like Putin and Orban and Trump. And what we see in Hungary, and I believe we're also seeing it in the US with No Kings, is a kind of revival of personal politics and local organizing and people trying to build coalitions back in the three-dimensional world. Another thing which is shifting or which has become hard for this kind of politician is the claim that we're the ones who are for peace. So Orban said, "Oh, we're for peace because we want the Ukrainians to surrender because Russia is right. We're the peace guys, and everybody else is the war guys." And Trump and MAGA have a similar story, like everybody else is for war. We're going to bring you peace. But then when you start fighting major wars, that story gets harder to uphold. And in the case in Hungary itself, Orban's alliance with Putin was not popular, and it wasn't in accord with the majority of most Hungarians who did understand that Ukraine was fighting a necessary defensive war. And then another thing which is shifting, which you've already said, is the connection between people being able to find the connection between elite corruption and their own standard of living. And of course, there is a connection. In Hungary, it was particularly brazen because the European Union is literally transferring money, which is supposed to go to Hungarian farmers. And Orban is finding ways to send it off to his pals. And also, it's like it's like a movie, or like Trump for that matter. They start building these ugly things all over the countryside, right? Which are sort of, physical markers of opulence and corruption. So all those things are, shifting, I think, for everybody. And that gives some hope if you want there to be change. But there's also this particular connection, which is that Orban has been propping up Trump, not the other way around. Orban's been propping up Trump, and now that's going to be gone. And if you're opposing Trump, the way that the Hungarians organized over the long term with big coalitions in public, mocking the leader, using local journalism, all that stuff, it can reaffirm some of the things that you might be doing between now and November.
To start to parse the president's behavior coming out of something like this, today we see which he's been doing, sort of engaging with the Pope in some kind of argument that the Pope largely refuses to address, at least by name anyway. And then, I don't know if you've had a chance in your academic career to look up today and see the image of him posted as Jesus that he now says is him being portrayed as a doctor that was suggesting his powers. How do you see the president crafting his image, especially coming out of this and now likening himself to Jesus, as some say, or at least a doctor in his own words?
Okay. Political analysis, and then I'm going to try the metaphysical part. The political analysis is that Trump is somebody whose whole image depends on being a winner. That is his whole story, that he was able to win, that he's a rich guy, that he's a plutocrat, that he knows how to bend the rules or break the rules. And his appeal to Americans was always something like that I'm the guy who has the secret, and you can be in on the secret so long as you're in with me. And that was always an entertainment story. I mean, it's the kind of story that Americans love. We love winners and we love people who break the rules, etc. He was tapping into that. But for that story to work, it's actually easier for him to have that story when he's not in power. Because when he's not in power, like the story's under his control, he can just make another episode of The Apprentice and fire somebody. But when he's in power, he actually takes losses over and over again. He took a huge, I mean, the Iran war, I think the depths of the American loss there are really just beginning to be understood. And then with Hungary, like he went out, he said, Orban's my guy, vote for Hungary, vote for Orban. And, I think the truth is that Hungarians just didn't listen. But from an American point of view, that's obviously been humiliating that, he went out, his son went out, Vance physically traveled to Budapest, and then they just got smacked. I mean, that was a huge electoral defeat. And so the political analysis would be this guy is taking loss after loss. That's hard on him personally and politically. And now I think he thinks he can win with Vatican City. And honestly, I think that's a huge misunderstanding. I mean, aside and apart from the obvious talents of the present Pope, the Vatican is used to dealing with people who have military power. Like they've been doing that for, going on a couple thousand years. This is not a new kind of contest for them. They know how to use symbols and language. And I think this is a mistake, but I think that's political calculation. Metaphysically, I want to see something a little bit deeper here. I think Trump is not fighting with the Pope. He's fighting with God. I think Trump's problem with the Pope, and I mean this in all sincerity, this is not a joke at all. I think his problem with Pope Leo is that Pope Leo is a believer. Pope Leo actually does believe, and Pope Leo is preaching from his belief. And for Trump, this is a tremendous problem because for him, for Trump, the essence of Christianity is worshiping an entity, and that entity is now supposed to be Trump. So I think it's actually for Trump a kind of proxy war where Leo is the proxy for God and he's actually fighting God. And if that seems exaggerated, then we just have to dwell on the image that you mentioned, which was his next step, where he literally pictures himself as, one of the Trinity, as Jesus Christ. And I was heartened. I mean, one looks for these little signs. But I was heartened to see that people who in Trump's political camp who identify themselves as Christians, that some of them at least took offense to this and said that this sort of thing ought not to be happening. And I mean, I think from a moral point of view, it's just, it's blasphemous and offensive. But from a political point of view, it reveals where he is. He's in this self-deification stage where, we have to acknowledge that he's some kind of special entity because his victories are no longer on earth, right? He's losing everything on earth. So we have to just kind of stay with him regardless.
Well, let me just end by asking you, we don't have too much time left, but I want to ask, because this seems to be an ongoing conversation that we have on the Culture Show, and that's people who don't believe that they can affect change if this is what they want to do, and not necessarily understanding the import of a No Kings rally, for instance. You just mentioned the power of conversations, of social media, and people turning out. What do you see in a couple of weeks ago with the latest No Kings March and what you saw people do and how many people did that recently?
I appreciate that question. Yeah, I went to Cincinnati, Ohio for things this time, and I spoke to about 15,000 people. And I would emphasize, first of all, the joy of interacting with local organizers who are taking time and doing what they're good at, and the joy of interacting with folks who want to stand up and want to say this is not acceptable, and I've got better ideas of how the world can be. And I mentioned the joy because the joy is actually connected with effectiveness. If you're doing things with other people, you're going to feel more effective, but you also are going to be more effective. What the authoritarians try to do, what the totalitarians try to do, is to get you alone and to get you feeling like you can't do anything. And when you have that feeling, I'm sad to say it, but I'll put it directly. When you have that feeling is driving you politically in a certain direction, right? Like it's understandable. It's completely understandable. And I feel it sometimes too. I mean, terrible things happen to people around me. People I know, have been start to think I can't do anything, we're taking part in the process because all we have to do is the little bit that we can. If we just join, the local whatever indivisible, if we just go to one protest, if we just subscribe to one newspaper, if we just have one hard conversation at a bar, if we just do the little thing that we can, that will be enough. Like if enough of us do the little thing we can, that's going to turn out to be enough. This turning point in Hungary, the way that we describe it in the news, and this is understandable, is like there was an election one day and there was this huge surprising result. But that huge surprising result was the result of hundreds of thousands of people organizing and then millions of people showing up to vote. And those two things are connected, right? We can't, I mean, elections are hugely important. And this one in November is probably the most important midterm in the history of the US. And I personally think it has to do with the further existence of the US. But the way you get to an election and winning is not saying it's up to the opposition party, it's up to the people in the party. No, the opposition party is part of a larger coalition. And you don't even have to agree with them about everything. You just have to recognize that they, along protests, along with local organizers, along with labor unions, along with other folks who come along, they are part of a transformation. They're going to help halt things and then help turn things around. So I really appreciate that question because democracy doesn't depend upon, waiting for the next election. It doesn't depend on some larger force. It depends on people just doing a little bit and recognizing that they have just a little tiny bit of responsibility. That's where it starts.